Hello, everybody, and welcome to the presentation today. My name is Vanessa. I'm a qualitative and quantitative mentor here at Statistics Solutions. And today I will be presenting on confidently presenting your quantitative results chapter. Just before we get started, I'd like to share some information with you all in case you might be interested in additional support outside of today's webinar. Here at Statistics Solutions, we provide assistance with all aspects of the dissertation. So if you're interested in more one-on-one support, please feel free to use our contact information that's in the chat or on the slide here to get in touch with us. We do help with everything from topic development, all the way through drafting the chapters, all the way through to the final PowerPoint defense. So please do check that out if you're interested. So to give you an overview of today's presentation, we are going to be reviewing the results chapter. Typically, the components that are included in the results chapter are the introduction, data collection and preparation, demographics and descriptive statistics, assumptions testing, analysis of research questions or hypotheses, and then a summary. Today's presentation will focus on quantitative results. We have other resources available on our website and other webinars that are geared towards qualitative methods. So if you're interested in qualitative methods, this may not be the webinar for you, but we will be going through all of the quantitative components of the results section here today. And then one important note, as you go through this webinar, these sections are pretty typical and standard sections that are used in this chapter. But if you have any resources available to you from your chair or your committee that outline specific sections that they expect, it's always a good rule of thumb to refer to the template that they're providing you or the checklist that they're providing you, just to ensure that if there's any additional sections or specifications from your school, that you're including it in your dissertation. So here is a really good place to start if you don't have a prescribed kind of list available to you. But if you do, I do recommend always referring to what's given to you by your school. And then at the end of the presentation today, I will open it up for questions and answers. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat as we go through, or to put them in the Q&A, and I'll do my best to answer them at the end. Also, you will receive a copy of the slides and the recording for today's presentation. So that will be available to you as well. So let's start out by talking about the purpose of the results chapter. This chapter is for you to present the data analyses that you've conducted to answer your specific research questions and hypotheses. So in the previous chapters of the dissertation, namely the introduction, the literature review, and the methodology chapter, you are setting up the why and the how of your research. So that's where you're really talking about the gap in the literature, why you think it's important to conduct this research, and then you're outlining the method that you intend to follow to do it. By the time you get to this results chapter, you will have already conducted your research, and you will have already run any analyses that you plan to run. So here it's just time to present those findings and present what was found in your research. So in this chapter, you're going to be answering your research questions that have already been pre-established in the preceding chapters. And by the end of this chapter, the reader should understand the findings for each particular research question or hypotheses. So if your study has 5 research questions, you should be presenting results to each research question in this section. Something you don't really want to do in this section is interpret these results. So this section should be pretty stats heavy. This is where you're really giving all of the facts and figures and numbers that relate to your analysis. and then what that means for the greater body of literature or the practice that you're studying, or the phenomenon that you're studying, whatever it may be. That interpretation is better suited for the discussion chapter. So you want to kind of hold off on interpreting those results until you've gotten through this chapter. And then again, what I mentioned earlier, it's always best to follow the guidance and requirements of your school or your degree program. So if you have any checklists, templates, or previous dissertations available to you from your program, it's always a good place to start to just take a look at that and see how they've structured their results, what types of information they're reporting, just to ensure that you're aware of the expectations before you get started. So now we'll get into the components of the chapter. So you'll start off with the introduction. This is going to be very similar to each of the introductions that you've written for chapters 1 through 3. So you'll start off by restating the purpose of your study. And then you'll go into restating the research questions or the hypotheses. Now, when you're doing this, it's important to make sure that you are restating these research questions and hypotheses verbatim. So you want to make sure that they are stated the same way that they've been stated in the other chapters of your dissertation. And that's just because you want the reader to have a very clear picture of what you're studying. So you don't want to kind of obscure the meaning of your research questions by changing the wording around. So it can start to get redundant, but that's totally okay. You can pretty much just copy and paste these research questions throughout your chapters. And then when you're restating the purpose of your study, again, we want to make sure that you're staying as true to the meaning of the original purpose that you've already outlined. So you can restate it verbatim, or you can provide an abbreviated version of the purpose, but just make sure that as you read through the chapters, the way that you've written it sounds consistent with what you've stated in earlier chapters. And then so once you've done that, you've reoriented your reader to your study, you'll just want to outline the contents of the results chapter to give them a preview of what will be coming up in this section. So one way that you can do that is by simply listing out the section headers that will appear in this chapter. The next section will usually be the data collection and preparation section. So this is where you want to summarize the data collection procedures that you followed, and also note any changes from your originally proposed data collection procedures. So much of the results section will be things that you have already outlined or planned in your methods chapter. You've probably at this point already described what your data collection plan would be. And now is when you're just going to kind of report back on that. So you said what you would do, but given that a lot of times things might change or things might come up in this section, now you'll just want to report what you actually did. So if you had deviations from your plan, they will go in this section here. Some things that that could change, for example, are possibly having to sample from a different population than you originally intended. So for example, if you intended on studying fourth grade teachers at the high school, fourth grade, the elementary school down the road, but maybe when it came time to actually collect the data, the school didn't grant you permission to conduct your study there at that school. So if that's what you outlined in your methods chapter, and when it came time, you weren't able to do that, maybe you had to switch and collect data from a different elementary school or from a different grade. Whatever that looks like for your study, this is where you'll report that deviation. Other things that may have changed, it could be your sampling method. So maybe originally you intended to use random sampling, but that wasn't feasible for your study and you had to go with a more purposive sample. You'll want to talk about that as well. And then once you start to talk about these deviations, you'll want to finally get into what actually happened during that data collection. So how many total responses did you receive? What did you do with regards to including or excluding particular responses? And then did you conduct any post hoc power analyses if you weren't able to meet your target sample size? So that target sample size is another area where you might be reporting a deviation. If you intended on collecting data from maybe 100 participants, but you weren't able to, you may need to conduct a post hoc power analysis to give your reader an idea of what the implications of your changed sample size mean for the results of your study. And then once you've discussed that, you'll want to get into the preliminary data preparation steps. So if you were conducting a paper and pencil survey, having people fill out surveys in person. When you are preparing the data, you most likely need to go ahead and input that data into an Excel sheet or some type of electronic format so that you can analyze it. So here in this preparation step, you want to talk about how you ensured that moving that data from paper to pen was accurate when you were typing it in, or however you were moving it over. So you'll want to outline any procedures that you took for that. And then you'll also want to talk about how you handle missing data. So it's very common that you may have participants who skip questions or forget to answer questions. And so you'll just want to talk about what your plan is to deal with those questions. So it could be that you're going to do some sort of imputation to maybe take mean scores of those particular questions that were missing to fill in that missing data. Or it could be that you're going to completely exclude missing data. Whatever the process looks like for you, you'll just want to talk about that here. You'll also want to talk about any outliers. So if you have outliers, will you include them in your data analysis, or will those be excluded? And then provide any rationale for the decisions that you've made. And then the next step will just be to talk about any scoring or coding of variables that are going to take place that you need to do before analyzing the data. So for example, I recently analyzed some survey data, and I wanted to know how long women took maternity leave for. And my survey questions were written in a way that I couldn't get just a straight answer for that question. One question asked, how long was your unpaid maternity leave? And another question asked, how long was your paid maternity leave? So to get at the variable that I was interested in, I needed to combine these two survey questions. So you may find that you have to do something like that for your survey as well. You may need to combine questions or recode questions in a way that makes more sense for analysis. So you'll want to talk about that process as well. I see we have a question in the chat about secondary data analysis. So if you are doing a study that requires you to access archival data, instead of talking about how you actually collected the data, you will want to talk about the process that you went through to obtain the data set that you did. So for example, if you are maybe collecting, I'll go back to that kind of pregnancy example. If you are analyzing data from the PRAMs, which is a source from the CDC, you typically need to submit a request for that data with some rationale for why you need it. And there's typically like a 4 to 6 week turnaround on that. So you'll just want to talk about the process that you went to access the data set that you are interested in if you're doing some secondary data analysis. Okay, so now I'm just going to show you guys some examples of what this would look like in your paper. So here we have an example where we first state the total number of responses. So in this case, we're talking about how we excluded responses, and we're explaining our final sample size. So we have our total number of responses. We had 485 survey responses. And in this case, the researcher is excluding any survey responses where 50% or more of the questions were not answered. So in this case, they removed responses, resulting in a sample size of 396. So this is how you might explain your data collection procedures for excluding responses. And here's another example with a little bit more information. So here we have the information about how the data collection took place. Again, we state the total number of participants that responded. So in this case, we have 163 participants access the survey. And then we go into detail about the participants that were excluded for various reasons. So here they either didn't agree to the informed consent, or they had a certain amount of responses missing, or they didn't meet the inclusion criteria for the study. So if that was the case, we excluded their responses. And then we provide the final sample size. So in this case, we've got our final sample size of 98. So we reduced our sample size quite a bit from the initial 163 responses. And then we also here talk about any, oh, sorry, that's my next example. So this example here, we're talking about any post hoc analysis that was conducted. So if you do have to exclude too many responses, then you may want to conduct a post hoc analysis to just kind of provide some explanation for your sample size. So here we're stating that we're doing the post hoc power analysis, and we're stating the statistical tests that were done for this analysis. So in this case, we're doing a t-test and a regression. And for each test that you do the post hoc analysis for, you want to state what the sample size was. So our group sizes for our t-test and our sample size for our multiple linear regression test are listed out here. And then we state the level of power that was obtained for each test. So once you've discussed all of your data collection and data preparation procedures, you can start getting into your descriptive statistics. So in this section, you want to provide descriptives for the demographic variables in your study, for all of the variables of interest. So if you are conducting a study that's looking at depression and self-efficacy, you want to describe the distribution of those variables. So for any variables that are categorical, you will want to provide the frequencies and the percentages. So for example, gender, ethnicity, grade level. For those types of variables, you'll want to provide those descriptives. And then for anything that's continuous, so like age, weight, GPA, you will want to provide the mean and the standard deviation. And then the purpose of this step is to help your reader understand the distribution of these variables in your sample as compared to the population. So this is really just helping the reader understand if your sample is representative of the general population. So if you have population statistics available to you, for instance, if you're conducting a study of fourth grade teachers down the road, you may want to give some statistics on the general gender and ethnic breakdown of fourth grade teachers in the United States. And that's going to help your reader understand if your sample is similar or not. So for example, if your sample only has women, or your sample only has a particular race or ethnicity, it may not be very representative of the population, and that will have implications for the generalizability of your results. So it's important to think about this also when you're collecting the data, so that when you get to this step, you're providing kind of a cross-section of the population in your sample that is going to be representative of the population. And then another thing that you'll want to do in this section here is present the reliability coefficients, so the Cronbach's alpha for any appropriate measures. So this would mainly be for survey instruments that have multiple items. So for instance, if you're using a survey to measure self-esteem and it has 10 questions, you may need to run the Cronbach's alpha on those 10 questions just to make sure that this instrument is reliable in your sample. And so we will go through a few examples of this. So in this example, we're showing a breakdown of the categorical variables. I know earlier I mentioned that age is continuous, but just a reminder, if you do break age out into categories, then it is a categorical variable. So in this case, we are reporting the demographics or the descriptives for gender and then these age groups. One thing that's important to note here is that as you present your results, the organization of the table should be accompanied by some type of narrative description. So you never really want to just provide the table. You also do want to kind of summarize what your table is representing in some type of text. So here you'll notice they kind of represent the high points in the narrative. So rather than providing each variable, we're just providing the summary. So the majority of participants were men between the ages of 30 to 44 years of age, and the most commonly reported job position among the participants was computer information research. So again, just reporting those high points, but then having all of the data available in the table below. When you're putting these tables together with the narrative, it's also best practice to make sure that you are keeping them close together. So if you're referencing table 1, try to have table 1 pretty soon after the paragraph rather than kind of like having all your tables at the end of the chapter. That'll just help the reader follow along with the data that you're presenting. And then in this example, we are presenting the continuous descriptive statistics. So these are our continuous variables. Again, we have age, but this time it's in years, so it's a continuous variable. We're also reporting time and then nurse to patient ratio. So these differ in that before we were reporting the percent and the frequency, whereas here, since these are continuous variables, you're going to want to present the mean, the standard deviation, and then you can also provide the minimum and the maximum if that is appropriate for your variables. And then this example is how you might present the Cronbach's alpha reliability coefficient. So you may want to present the number of items that were in the scale. So for example, here we've got a few subscales that we're reporting on. We've got positive attributes. We indicate how many items were in that positive attribute scale, so 13. And then we're reporting the alpha level. So in this case, it was 0.93. And again, you will receive copies of these slides so you can look back on these examples. The next step is going to be to discuss the assumptions testing. So before we can get to the actual analyses that you've conducted, we want to talk about how you ensured that you could conduct the particular test that you decided on. So essentially all inferential statistics that you do or that you would use to answer your research questions have some sort of statistical assumptions associated with those tests. So if we think back to stats class, if you conduct a t-test, the t-test requires that the normality is met and also homogeneity of variance. And that goes for multiple tests. So each test has different assumptions. So you may want to have a section here where you are specifically talking about those assumptions that you tested. Again, different schools will have different requirements, so definitely check in with your school to see how they want this reported. But generally, for each test that you're doing, you will want to list and discuss the required assumptions for that test. So if you are doing a t-test or an ANOVA, you may need to discuss those assumptions that I mentioned earlier. So normality and homogeneity of variance. And what you'll want to do is you'll want to state how the assumption was tested. So for instance, if you are testing for normality, how do you plan to do that? You could do that by looking at the skewness or kurtosis. You could also look at a histogram. You could also conduct a Shapiro-Wilks test. So whatever method you intend to use, you'll want to mention it here. And then you'll want to state exactly what the results of that test were. So you'll want to have a clear statement about whether or not the assumption was met. And then if the assumption was not met, you want to describe any action that you're taking, based on that violation. So what are you going to do about that? Do you plan on transforming the data or the variables to make the data normal if it wasn't normal? Will you remove outliers that are causing the data to be non-normal? Or perhaps are you going to run an alternative test? So for example, if you intended to do a t-test with normal data, but then your data wasn't normal, will you maybe shift gears and do a non-parametric test instead? So those are some considerations for this section here. And I have some examples. So in this first example, we are testing for normality. And to do that here, we are using a PP plot. So here we present the plot in the figure, and we state that the data showed no significant deviation from the normal line, which indicates that the data are normal. And then we give we let the reader know if the assumption was met or not. So in this case, because the data appeared to follow the line, we conclude that the assumption was met. Now, in this example, we are testing for outliers. So we say that we are testing for the outliers, and we state that we observe an outlier in the data, and then we indicate that we're going to be excluding this outlier from the analysis. So here we're testing that assumption, and based on the findings of the assumption, we're talking about what we're doing about the violation. So in this instance, the researcher chose to just get rid of those outliers to make the data normal. So once you've done all of that, I know it seems like a lot of steps, you can finally get into the actual results of your research questions. So the way that you organize this section should typically be organized by research question. So starting from your first research question all the way going down and just talking about the results underneath each particular research question. I find that that's a very easy and simple way for the reader to follow along with your results. And similar to your data collection procedures, if there's any changes from your originally proposed data analysis plan, you'll want to talk about that here in this section, especially if you did have changes in that data collection section. You most likely, there was most likely an impact to the data analysis. So you'll just want to explain and justify any new data analysis procedures that you ended up using for your results chapter. And then for each analysis, you want to clearly identify the variables that are used in the analysis. So if you are doing something like a t-test or an ANOVA, you want to clearly identify the independent and dependent variables. If you're doing a correlational analysis like your regression, you want to identify the predictor variables, your criterion variable, and any covariates that were included in the analysis. And then you will want to provide the appropriate statistics associated with each test. Most tests that you run will have a p-value, so it will be important to report that. And then you'll also want to report in some instances, the effect size that was associated with the test, as well as the confidence intervals and the test statistic for the corresponding tests. So if you are doing a t-test, you may want to present the t-statistic and the degrees of freedom. Whereas if you're doing an ANOVA, you would be reporting the f-statistic, and then again, you would be reporting the degrees of freedom. If your analysis requires any post hoc testing, then you'll want to present the results of those post hoc tests as well. And this is different from the post hoc that I talked about earlier, where we had an insufficient sample size or an unintended sample size. This differs in that the post hoc is used, for example, in an ANOVA test. If you have a significant finding in the ANOVA, you may need to do a post hoc to determine exactly the nature of the differences that were identified in the ANOVA. So if you have a test that requires a post hoc, then you'll want to report the findings of that as well. And then importantly, this section should also include clear statements that answer each research question and hypotheses based on the results of the analysis. So after you present those statistics for each test that you've run, you'll want to interpret the statistic and make a statement that answers the research question. Now, when I say interpret the statistic, I don't mean to provide an explanation for what that statistic means for these variables or for people involved in the study. So for example, if you are doing a study on depression and self-efficacy, it doesn't mean to say, okay, individuals who are depressed have lower self-efficacy and that means XYZ. Instead, it's really just providing that statement, that plain statement of what the results mean. And I'll get into some examples of that. Typically in a quantitative study, you may have your hypotheses written in the null and the alternative format. And if that is the case for your study, you will also want to provide, or it's sufficient to provide a statement just about the null hypothesis. So you may say that you found no statistically significant results, and so you failed to reject your null hypothesis, or vice versa. But now we'll get into some examples of how you might write that up. So this example here features a t-test. We start off by saying the type of analysis that we're doing. So an independent samples t-test was conducted. Then we state what our independent and dependent variables are. So here we are trying to determine if there were differences in the SAI based on gender. So we're looking at total scores based on gender. So our gender is then going to be our independent variable and our scores are our dependent variable. Then we provide the relevant statistics. So we provide the t-statistic, the degrees of freedom in parentheses, the p-value, and in this case, we're also giving the effect size. Once you've done that, then you can give that plain interpretation. So a non-significant test would mean that there are no differences between the groups. And we make a statement that answers our hypothesis. So here we say that our null hypothesis was not rejected. And then you might want to display any statistics that are relevant to your analysis in a table. So for a t-test, it may make sense to provide means per group and the standard deviations per group, so your reader can understand how these means differed or how they compare to each other. So here's another example of a t-test, but in this case, we have a significant result. So we state our independent and dependent variables. We state that our t-test is significant, and this time our p-value is less than 0.05, so our p-value is 0.002, and that is what indicates to us that this is a significant result. And then we give a statement about our hypotheses. So because our p-value is significant, we can reject the null hypotheses in this case. And then again, we're providing those mean and standard deviation values to give the reader an idea of how these groups differ. Now, in this example, we are doing a one-way ANOVA. So again, we're stating what test we're doing. We are telling the reader what our independent and dependent variables are. And then we are presenting the results. So in this case, rather than reporting the T statistic, we're reporting the F. So F is 0.76. In the ANOVA, we have 2 degrees of freedom instead of 1. So we have 4 and 102. And then we're giving our p-value. In this case, the p-value is greater than 0.05, which is our significance level. So in this case, we can conclude that our results are not statistically significant. And so we are unable to reject the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis was not rejected. And since this is an ANOVA, we have more than 2 groups. So we're reporting the mean and the standard deviation for each of the groups that were included in the analysis. Here's an example of how we might present results of a correlational analysis. So here we are restating the research question first. So we're reminding the reader of the research question. And this is a practice that can be done for any of the types of tests. This is just kind of another stylistic choice here. And then as far as the statistics that we're going to report for correlational analysis, we are reporting our R, so Pearson's R, and then the p-value that was associated with each correlation. So that's why you see multiple statistics reported here. And then we again will make a statement based on our results to indicate whether or not we are rejecting the null hypothesis. Here, we do have a significant correlation, so we can reject the null, and we let the reader know of that. In this case, the researcher was using the annotation for null hypothesis. That's another option that can be used. And then for the correlational analysis, you might have a table showing all of the correlations. If you're doing a correlation matrix, you might also present that. And you can indicate which are significant with the star or something like that. And then here's an example of a regression analysis. So if you're doing a regression analysis, you usually start by stating the results or significance of your overall regression model, which would be an F test. So that's what you'll find in this first sentence here. We are restating our F statistics. So F equals 3.03, the degrees of freedom associated with that test. So 9 and 115. Presenting the p-value 0.003. And then you may also want to state the R squared, so the percent of variance explained. If the regression is significant, you'll want to talk about that as well. In this case, our p-value is less than 0.05, so it's significant, and we are rejecting the null hypothesis. And then usually for a regression analysis, you would want to present a table showing the individual predictors for the regression. So you might present it in a table like this, where we're showing the results for each regression coefficient. And then you might interpret the regression coefficients that are significant in your model. So in this case, it looks like one variable in the regression here is significant. So this variable, we see the significance level is less than 0.001. So you may want to indicate that, which is shown here in this last sentence of our narrative description of the table. So after you've presented all of that information, you'll just want to provide the reader with a summary of your results. So you can either summarize the entire contents of the results chapter, or you can just summarize the answers to each of your research question. In this section, you'll want to make sure you restate the answer to each research question or hypothesis, and just reiterate again whether each null hypothesis was rejected or not rejected. And then you'll just want to provide a transition to the next chapter for your reader. So in the next chapter, you'll be discussing the implications of these findings, and you can indicate that here to let the reader know what's coming up. But that does bring us to the end of the slides. So again, if this was helpful to you or you feel that you might benefit from more one-on-one assistance, we do provide a free 30-minute consultation where you can share information about your research, and we can identify areas where you might need help and do kind of an a la carte system together to see, how we can best help you. But I will open it up for questions now.